You are listening to Radio VoR in London. I'm Scott Craig. The potential impacts of global warming could be severe, pervasive and irreversible. That's the conclusion of a major new report into climate change by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. The report cites things like rising sea levels and melting glaciers and says no one will be left untouched by the effects of climate change, while the report has prompted climate scientists and politicians alike to call for urgent action, including calls for moving towards a zero-carbon economy. But the report has also come in for criticism, both of its conclusions and of its media coverage. So what are we to make of all of this? Is it science or politics? And how practical is it to move towards a zero-carbon Britain? To discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Steve Connor. He's science editor at The Independent. Fiona Harvey is the environment correspondent for The Guardian newspaper. And joining us by Skype and by phone, Dr. Benny Peiser, director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and Dr. Tony Juniper, who is a leading British environmentalist. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining the discussion. There is a lot to get through with this, obviously, and we are talking about some very complex issues here. I thought, first of all, perhaps you could each just give your brief reaction to the IPCC report. Steve, what did you make of it?
Well, I think the first thing to realise is that this isn't just any old report cobbled together at the last minute. This is a very careful synthesis of existing scientific knowledge drawn from the expertise of 2,000 people, 436 authors, 309 lead authors from 70 countries. So really this is the most comprehensive assessment of the impacts of climate change to date that's been done anywhere in the world. It's the fifth such assessment, but it's the most thorough assessment of its type. It looks at food supplies, water scarcity, species loss, the effect on the global economy, human security, and various other matters. And the basic conclusion is that climate change is happening. It's happening on all continents, across all oceans. And if we do not do something about it, then we will basically end up living in a different world to what we're used to.
Fiona, what was your initial response to the IPCC report?
Well, I agree with Steve on the incredible importance of this report. And this is, of course, the second part of three parts of this report. The first part, which came out last year, that said it was absolutely certain, really, beyond any doubt, really, any scientific doubt, that global warming was occurring and the climate's changing, and it's happening as a result of our actions. This part of the report sets out some of the consequences of that from, as we've just heard, rising sea levels, very, very dire impacts on food security in many parts of the world, the acidification of our oceans, and extreme weather events arise in the frequency and severity of many extreme weather events, and they could be storms, floods, droughts, and so on, of the kind that we've seen around the world. There will be other consequences as well, as food security decreases, as it becomes more difficult to live in many parts of the world, people will start to move, and that's an important consequence of this. And so finally, very soon we're also expecting the third part of this comprehensive review of climate change, and in that third part we will get to some of the potential solutions to this. So you asked the question, about politics and science. Well, I think this is very clearly about science. These are all scientists here who've completed this report. And the political part is what our politicians do with it. And that will happen next in their response to it. So a very, very clear scientific warning.
Benny Peiser, would you agree with that?
Well, as usual, there is a discrepancy between the small print and what the policymakers put in the summary for policymakers, the kind of executive summary that was negotiated between the scientists and between government officials a week ago. And of course, the government officials were adamant that they wanted a much stronger language, and they managed to get that into the summary. So there is very strong language in the summary, but when you look at the report and the small print, the report isn't that bad and certainly not as alarmist as the language used by the summary or by the media. The most important aspect of that report is twofold. One, it is about impacts way into the future. It looks at scenarios, what would happen to agriculture if we had 2.5-degree warming in 100 years' time. And the economic damage is much, much lower than the Stern report estimated, on which Britain's climate policies are based. And secondly, perhaps even more important, is the realization that in all likelihood there won't be an international agreement, and therefore it makes more sense to adapt to the climate change that is going to happen, whether it will be moderate warming or whether it will be strong warming. We don't know that, but the overall estimate is that governments will have to refocus a lot on adaptation and make sure that whatever the climate will throw at us, we can deal with.
Tony, Juniper, let me bring you in there just for your initial thoughts before we get into some of the detail of this.
Well, I very much agree with Fiona and Steve in terms of the importance of this report and the very clear signal that it's providing us in terms of the threat posed by climate change, both in an economic and social sense, and indeed the environmental consequences that will accompany it. But one of the things that strikes me is just the way in which the debate continues to cast doubt about the veracity of the science and the extent to which that's being used to delay the kinds of action that we need to avoid the worst consequences of this. And it's very interesting how this framing of the science now as being about adaptation rather than cutting emissions, and the extent to which we are able, it is claimed, to be able to simply continue with business as usual and to adapt our way around the kinds of consequences that will follow. I mean, just think about Hurricane Haiyan that hit the Philippines last year and the devastation caused by that. For a developing country, and there are obviously many in a similarly vulnerable position around the world, being able to adapt to those kinds of catastrophes is simply not feasible. And we're already seeing those kinds of storms, and that these are going to escalate as the warming progresses. And we could be seeing 4 degrees of warming during the course of this century.
Steve, this really does depend on where you're looking at it from, doesn't it, geographically? I mean, I've just returned from a trip to Bangladesh, and the situation there was pretty stark. Are we looking at this too much in terms of the potential impact on Britain and not enough more globally?
Well, I think there are some parts of the world that will be affected more than others, already beginning to be affected. But I think we have to take into account that we live in a global economy, so anything which affects global food prices will have an impact on us in Britain. But just take up a point that Benny made about food production in the future, when temperatures reach 2 degrees global average. Food production is already being affected by global warming, according to this report. The food production of maize and wheat is already being affected. Although the food production has increased, the rate of increase has not gone as fast as it could have done had it not been for climate change. So we're already beginning to see the effects. I mean, that's the whole point about this report. We are seeing the effects now, and unless we do something about it because of the inertia of the climate system, it's actually going to be very difficult to do something about if we leave it for another 20, 30 or 40 years.
I just want to bring in another voice here as well. Dr. Maria Sharman from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research is joining the discussion now as well. Dr. Sharman, welcome to you. What is your reaction to the report? How significant do you think it is, and how stark is the warning bell sounded by the IPCC?
Well, it's not actually anything new. It just confirms what we already know, and it's just another call for action, a call to act amongst all other calls that we already heard. So the evidence is just becoming stronger, and we don't need any more evidence to act, really. We're already heading towards a 4 to 6 degrees C warming by the end of the century. And most people I know who work in this area, they say that the 4 degrees C world is unlivable. We need to avoid it at all costs. And at all costs mean that we should do everything we can do to decarbonize, to make our energy system low carbon. So there's no question about whether we need to act or not and when we need to do it. We just need to do it now, literally.
Fiona, this idea about a low-carbon economy or a zero-carbon Britain is being touted as one of the possible solutions to this. And I know that it's something that you've written about some of the problems that are associated with the economics of low carbon as well. How do you see low carbon working?
Well, we absolutely need a low carbon economy to work because, Dr. Peiser was suggesting that we could adapt our way out of this problem. But trying to adapt your way out of the problem while we're still pouring greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere is like trying to run a bath without the plug in it. We can't outrun this problem while we're still creating greenhouse gases. So the way to do that is to invest in low carbon technology. Now that takes a number of forms. It could be renewable energy, such as different forms of wind energy, tidal energy, and so on. Nuclear energy could have a role because, again, it doesn't produce the greenhouse gases that we get from fossil fuels. More controversially, some people suggest that gas, for instance, shale gas, could play a role because it is lower carbon than coal, but it is still a fossil fuel and still carries greenhouse gas emissions. So we do need to be rather careful about that. And then the other ways in which we need to move to a low carbon economy are not just in how we generate our energy. It's also about becoming more efficient in the way that we use energy and other resources. It's about the way we build our buildings. It's about our transport and using public transport or for instance, walking or cycling for short journeys where possible, how we design our cities so that people can move around more easily and without generating so many emissions. Here at the moment in London, we've got some of the worst smog that's ever been recorded, and a large part of that is owing to emissions from traffic. So, moving to a low-carbon economy isn't a painful thing in many ways. It's actually a great thing because not only will we benefit from lower greenhouse gas emissions, we will also have health benefits in the form of less air pollution, and we will have social benefits in the form of a nicer life really for people because your things should be better designed. We should be able to get along without using quite so many resources, and there is a cost to that because you can't just move to that overnight. You do need investment, but we need to invest in our infrastructure anyway. The population of this country is growing, so we can't get away with just not investing in energy, not investing in transport, not investing in buildings. And if we're going to make those investments, we should make them low carbon. That makes sense.
You've written as well about the idea of or the danger of a carbon bubble. What did you mean by that?
Well, that's a really interesting idea, and the basis of that is that if you look around us at the most of the business world today, at companies who might be flying high in the stock market and so on, a lot of their assets and investments are based in a high carbon economy. So very obvious examples are fossil fuel companies, the oil giants, gas giants and so on of this world. But it also might involve, for instance, transport companies, people who make cars that might be high carbon, very inefficient cars. Buildings, construction companies who maybe aren't adapting to looking at a low carbon world. And so all of those assets are essentially at risk. Because if we have to move to a low-carbon world, which the IPCC is very clear that we will, then those assets will become worthless. Maybe not entirely, not worth anything at all, but they will certainly be worth a lot less than they are. And that means that a lot of people who are invested in the current stock market are exposing themselves to very great risks.
Benny Peiser, I just want to be clear really on your position. Your position is essentially that the IPCC report and some of the effects that it highlights are either not happening or are exaggerated.
Neither. I actually said that if you read the small print, the impacts aren't as dramatic, and there are much more problematic developments that the world is faced to tackle in coming decades. But the main point, our main criticism really, or my main criticism, is the failure of people to realize that governments have heard this message or this warning for the last 20, 25 years. And Dr. Sharman made the point, this is nothing new. We've had similar reports over the last the IPCC was founded 25 years ago, and the warnings have come ever since. So we have to ask, why is it that the governments of this world are not following the advice? Why are they not coming to an agreement to cap CO2 emissions? That is the key issue. The reality is that despite 2 decades of warnings, the governments are unable to come to an international agreement, which means that whatever we are doing in Britain or in Europe has really no consequences on CO2 emissions, which are rising and rising rapidly. So the big question is, what is it that is keeping governments from taking the actions that the IPCC is suggesting or is advising?
Vested interests, I think.
And the reality is that most countries of the world are relying overwhelmingly and will remain to rely overwhelmingly on conventional fossil fuel-based energy. In fact, in some countries, coal-fired power plants. There are currently, I think, 1,000 coal-fired power plants being built around the world. So we have to accept reality. We can't close our eyes and just continue as if nothing has changed. The reality is these governments, most governments, are unwilling to give up on cheap energy. The renewables, the low-carbon alternatives are still not cheap enough, are still not competitive enough to make it attractive for governments to go in that direction. Even countries like Britain or Germany or America, which are promoting and subsidizing renewables, are facing a public that is increasingly doubtful whether the price...
Well, that's simply not true, is it, Benny? That's simply not true. There's very strong support for action on climate change.
Can I just finish? The problem is that the public are willing to pay a price if everyone shoulders the burden.
Benny, isn't there an argument, though, to support what Fiona is saying about, you raised the question yourself there about why countries are not moving towards low carbon, and surely one of the key aspects of that is simply big energy and the interests of oil and gas companies being protected by governments?
Well, I think that is the biggest myth. The reason that governments stick to cheap energy is not because they're all in the pockets of the oil industry or the coal industry. The reason is that governments and nations they are competing with each other. They are competing on labor costs and they are competing on energy costs. And if they feel that some countries get a benefit for not being or not taking their share of the burden, if they think that they are basically becoming less competitive because they are doing the heavy lifting and other countries are doing business as usual, you will sooner or later find that in those countries that have gone in the green direction and the renewables direction, there will be growing opposition. And this is exactly what is currently happening in many parts of Europe. Europe is concerned that its unilateral climate policy is punishing Europe and European economies because no one else is taking the same approach.
Tony, you've been trying to come in there. Are we looking at this in the wrong way, do you think? If we talk about it in terms of the economics of it, there's also a lot of money to be made from investments in renewables and in low-carbon technologies as well, isn't there?
It's the biggest business opportunity in history, in my opinion, providing the world with the infrastructure and the technologies and the transport networks to be able to go very low carbon basically means an enormous industrial job creation and entrepreneurial opportunity on a scale that is unprecedented. And the reason we're not going down that road yet at the speed that we should be, but bear in mind it is already beginning to happen, and not only in Western Europe. The country that's installed the biggest amount of solar power in recent times, in fact now has the biggest installed capacity in the world, is China, and the same goes for wind power there as well. That country has realised that there are growing export markets, that the science is only going in one direction, and that countries will need to decarbonise very quickly, and that means a lot of equipment and technological advancement being sold into the world market in a way that's going to generate jobs and economic benefits on a very considerable scale. The vested interests, of course, who are literally invested in business as usual, the coal, oil companies and the gas up to a certain level, they've been campaigning very hard. I don't know where Benny's organisation gets its money from, but they have been funding organisations to speak about the doubts about the science, of which there are now very few, and indeed none in terms of the basics as to the human impact on the climate system, and to put across this economic narrative that says that we can't afford to do this because it's too expensive and everything else and will harm growth. That has been put very firmly by organisations like the Global Climate Coalition for many years, who urge governments not to act and not to sign an international treaty because it would have these anti-competitive effects that they claimed would lose jobs. It's a very familiar business narrative that comes from vested interests that are challenged by new science that says that they need to change and invest in new technology. We saw it on ozone depletion, we saw it on vehicle standards, we saw it on water pollution, on air pollution. And what happens, it's a very predictable pattern. There is an initial attack casting doubt on the science. Then there's a phase where they say it's unaffordable and would cause economic disaster. And then we get into a phase of implementation when people suddenly realize that there's loads of money to be made. And that's exactly what happens, which is why we phased out ozone depleting chemicals and have got alternatives. It's why we've got cleaner vehicles, why we've got cleaner rivers in the West. All of these things now are being done by companies that are doing very well indeed, because once they realized that the solutions existed in a way which they could bring to market, then it happened very fast. And now governments, of course, need to create those market conditions. And we need to get more of those voices from the solutions side of industry to counter some of those, or to balance at least some of those there from the coal, oil and gas sector. Because those companies, those industries, they're embedded, they're big, they already employ people. The wind, solar, biomass companies that are growing, they're not actually yet embedded, and so they don't yet have that political voice. But once they start to get it, change is going to come very fast.
I want to come to Maria Sharman, but Benny, just to give you a brief opportunity to respond to that. Attorney Juniper making a couple of claims there about the funding of your organisation. Would you like to respond?
Well, he knows exactly that we don't accept any funding from energy vested interests. That's our position from the word go. We've never accepted any money. We will not accept any money from energy companies or anyone involved in energy companies. So that's ridiculous. But the more important point, if I may, is we've heard this for the last 25 years. We've heard that green energy is such a wonderful thing and so cheap and it will create jobs. If it were that easy and if it were the truth, why isn't this changing the landscape? CO2 emissions are rising. Every expert in the world is saying this is going to continue at least for the next 20, 30 years. And everyone is saying even if you double, treble, quadruple renewable energy, there will still be 75 to 80% of our energy needs, and energy demand is going through the roof in the developing world anyhow, will be relying on conventional fossil fuel-based energy. I'm not promoting fossil fuels because I like them. I don't. But the reality is, unless green energy becomes cheaper so that governments and people and companies are actually willing to employ them without heavy multi-billion subsidies, the problem will not be solved. And that is the reality. The reality is that the green energy sector has not yet managed to become competitive, and without handouts, they are not sustainable. The majority of economies will be relying on carbon rather than green energy. Unless you go for nuclear energy. But the Greens are against nuclear energy, and that is, that's a whole new debate.
It is indeed. I'd like to move on to Maria Sharman. Maria, Are we looking at this too much in terms of the headline, really? Because when you do get into the detail of this, there are really significant questions that are raised about food safety, food security, human security. This is really a much broader debate than just simply warming, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I think. But I do think that the detail are important, and especially the detail that relates to the economics of renewables and the economics of fossil fuels. And I think it's a mistake to call fossil fuel energy cheap. So apart from coal, that's cheaper than other sources of energy, but it's got other costs in terms of health impacts, for example. Other fossil fuel industry has been receiving globally state support for decades and decades, so it wouldn't have survived without the subsidies and the tax breaks, and it's still happening, it's still going on. And with new fossil fuel sources coming online, like shale gas and other unconventional sources, it's a more expensive, an increasingly expensive source of energy, and that's why it still receives state support. So it's unfair to compare it to renewables. That's a fairly new technology, and the fossil fuels use fairly mature technology, but they're still supported by the state. And in terms of employment, there was a recent study in Australia, and it's surprising how small the number of people the oil and gas sector employs. It contributes about 8 to 10% to the GDP, but it employs about 0.2% of labor force. And that's because it's a highly capital-intensive industry. So when we look at renewables, this is a highly labor-intensive industry, and Germany is a good example for that. For example, from the Zero Carbon Britain report, there are twice as many people employed in renewables industry than in all other industry sectors combined. And that's something to think about, and that's in terms of quantity only. When we think about the quality of the jobs, renewable industry creates local jobs, a lot of local jobs that cannot be outsourced for installation and maintenance. So it's not just manufacturing jobs. At the same time, the fossil fuel industry often ships around their own labor force to install their equipment, and they're often not local.
We're very nearly out of time, but I do just want to get in one other quick point. Steve, when you, as a journalist, a science editor who watches this debate forensically, what do you make of the conduct of the debate and the discussion surrounding this? Is it too politicized in a sense?
Well, one of the lead authors, Chris Fielding, very, very neatly summed it up. He said his job really is to construct a bell tower, and it's for other people to ring the bell, to warn people. And the higher he can build that bell tower, the further they can see, the more people can be informed about it. And basically the science now is ultra clear. It's been muddied over the years by, I have to say, organisations like Benny's, who, first of all questioned whether global warming was happening. Then they said, well, the benefits may outweigh the risks, etc., etc. Very clearly, this study shows that it's happening on all continents, and we better take notice of what they say.
Fiona, briefly, too much politics, too much about the politics and not the science?
Well, the IPCC report is all about the science, and that science is very clear. And, politics, that's the next step. So politicians need to step up to this. And in the past we do actually have international agreements on the climate. Every major economy in the world, including major developing economies, have agreed to limit and curb their greenhouse gas emissions, and they've agreed that at the international level. So we do have such agreements. It's not impossible. They're not enough at the moment. They don't go far enough, but at least that's a start. So as a world, we are beginning to deal with this. So it's not all doom and gloom.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so we'll have to leave it there, but no doubt something we will be coming back to. But my thanks today to my guests, Steve Connor, Fiona Harvey, Maria Sharman, Benny Peiser and Tony Juniper. You're listening to Radio VoR in London. Stay with us.